Have you ever played a video game, finished it, and wished, damn, I wish there was more? Then eventually there is some DLC released which adds some new content and it's just amazing. Well, basically this video is about that idea but regarding Lovecraft's writings. Lovecraft wrote for himself first and foremost, but he did also spend time ghostwriting, revising stories, and co-writing stories for other authors who by today's standards are completely unheard of. Probably the best example of this is Under the Pyramids, also known as Imprisoned with the Pharaohs, which Lovecraft ghostwrote for Harry Houdini. By the way, I'm excluding that story from this list because I see it quite often appearing in anthologies and it's basically 100% Lovecraft undiluted. I have a whole book of such stories as well as some others on my ebook reader, and after having read through them, there are certainly some quality stories here. Sometimes it's clearly Lovecraft's words on the page, but sometimes the language used is not his, being diluted with the writing style of other writers. Nonetheless, all the stories count as weird fiction and or cosmic horror. Some are good, some are not. The most notable thing with these stories is that they include elements Lovecraft himself wouldn't have naturally used, but these new elements don't undermine the weirdness or cosmic horror of the tale, if you get my meaning. An example would be setting the stories in places besides the typical New England area which Lovecraft loved so much. Which, when you think of it, is exactly what video game DLC is all about. It gives the gameplay new places to take place in, new weapons or characters not seen in the main game. So I think that analogy works very well. So in short, let's consider this the top 5 DLC for Lovecraft. Story number 1, The Mound. This story is probably my favorite and most detailed of the lot. It's set in rural Oklahoma and follows two narratives. The first narrative is that of an American Indian ethnologist who travels to the state and begins research of a supposed ancient Indian burial ground. That's already quite a creepy thing if you follow films like Poltergeist and Pet Sematary. Anyway, almost any people who try investigate it by digging there disappear, and the one guy who did survive and came back, yep, you guessed it, in typical Lovecraft style, he was batshit crazy. So of course, this ethnologist decides to go and start digging it up by himself, and he finds this bizarre canister made out of an unknown alien metal, and brings it back to the village. He opens it up and discovers scrolls in there, but they're written in Spanish. This is where the second narrative comes into play, that of a 16th century Spanish colonial explorer named Panfilo de Zamacona. This discovery makes up for the majority of the book and is really the most fun part. This explorer goes into a subterranean underworld full of mystery and horror. In this story, you'll discover a detailed hidden world, a mysterious race of humanoids, bizarre powers and abilities, and culminates in a typical Lovecraft-style ending that you will definitely enjoy. Number 2, The Curse of Yeegh. I included this story mainly just because of the snake god creature known as Yeegh. Yeegh is a name that pops up enough times in the Mythos, mainly in the board games made by Fantasy Flight and other games such as Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder, I think. In any case, these days Yeegh is up there with Tsathoggua, Hastur and Ithaqua as one of the second tier Mythos deities that pop up regularly enough in the Mythos, and I think people would like to know its origins. Also taking place in Oklahoma, it tells the story of a myth of a snake god called Yeegh who would hunt down those who harmed its offspring, that being regular snakes. Of course, one of the characters does just that, and fearful of all the Native American tales, decides to stop this potential fate. Can he? Included in the story is some madness, asylums, and horrific abominations. Read more to find out. I liked the story because it made quite a few references to the mythologies of the natives of North America and South America, specifically making mention of the Aztec deity, now bear with me, this is a bitch to pronounce, Quetzalcoatl, who was also associated with snakes, one of the mythological beings I was really interested about growing up. But apart from that, I wasn't exactly mind blown by the story, maybe because I don't particularly mind snakes. I think they're interesting creatures and to touch them it feels kind of nice. Maybe if it was a tarantula god I might be a little bit more terrified. Number 3, Winged Death. I am biased in adding this story to my list because this story is set partly in my home country of South Africa. It takes the stylings of a murder mystery and presents it mainly in diary entries, kinda like in Dracula, but all with a weird fiction flavor. If you've read any of Arthur Conan Doyle's weird fiction stories, you will understand what I'm talking about. It deals with the bitter rivalry and quest for revenge between two scientists in Africa who discover a type of tsetse fly with a bizarre ability, and also voodoo magic, possession, and mysterious African diseases. Everyone has AIDS! The story isn't scary as such, and there's no real taste of cosmic horror as you'd expect with Lovecraft. It's bizarre and more of a regular weird fiction type of thing, but it is an interesting read and not typical of Lovecraft, but clearly written by him with occasional mentions of cyclopean ruins and other phrases he is known for. It's like he put cosmic horror on pause and took a holiday to South Africa. Anyway, the story cannot be completely devoid of horror considering they put the fly from Winged Death on the book's cover, right? Number 4, Out of the Eons. Eons? Is that Aeons? Because it's got A? Aeons. Aeons or Eons, you know what I mean. This is probably the most typical Lovecraft story, one that would feel comfortable between the pages of any typical anthology. It deals with the discovery of a mummy found on a mysterious piece of land suddenly thrust up in the middle of the ocean. Already that sounds like Call of Cthulhu and Dagon, right? And it also deals with the attempts of a museum to demystify the bizarre origins of the mummy and the possibility that the mummy is actually linked with a terrible myth of an entity which, if true, would confirm the mythos and lead to terrible implications for humanity. The story is so rich in what's basically mythos lore. A lot of mentions and nods to previous Lovecraftian mythos stories, such as the mention of Yuggoth and the Migo, old tomes of knowledge like the Necronomicon and a Book of Ibon, the discovery of sunken sea cities, mummies, and the introduction of Gthanatoa, one of the now well-established second-tier mythos beings. It also gives some backstory to the things hinted about in The Whisperer in Darkness. All in all, this is vital Lovecraftian reading. This story stood out to me because one of the characters in the story suffered a fate that's probably more gruesome than anything I've read in any previous Lovecraft story.
He's fucked up.
I can't tell you what it is for the sake of spoilers, but there is absolutely no doubt that any death you can imagine would be preferable to that person's fate. Without spoiling anything, I can confirm that, in typical Lovecraft style, the confirmation of the horror is revealed in the last sentence. Number 5. The Horror in the Museum. This is my final choice, and it seems logical given that it's the story featured on this book's cover. I include it somewhat reluctantly, not because it's a poor story, but because for this list I try to include stories in the spirit of DLC, that being stories that are somewhat more unique than what Lovecraft typically wrote. But on the other hand, this story is most definitely Lovecraft and thus will appease Lovecraft fans. As you can guess from the title, it takes place in a museum, specifically a wax sculpture museum owned by a demented cultist named Rogers. The protagonist, a man named Jones, enters the museum one day and scoffs at Rogers' creations. These creations, as you'd expect, are all of lesser Lovecraftian monsters and such. Rogers says that Jones is too much of a pussy to stay locked in the museum alone at night. Rogers says, "Oh yeah? Hold my beer and watch this." So Rogers locks him in and cue the Lovecraftian tropes you'd expect. Horrific origins of the wax creatures are revealed, as well as the unique, never-before-seen Lovecraftian creature Ran-Tegoth. I like this story because it's probably the Lovecraft story that best features a cultist. Usually cultists are just made mention of and never directly confronted, barring old Castro in The Call of Cthulhu. It also sort of features the appearance of the Dimensional Shambler, a lesser mythos being whose name always made me wonder. Anyway, that's my video. I really recommend this book, and you can pick it up really cheaply for about less than $6 including postage. I'll put a link in the description where you can pick it up online. Can you think of any other stories that should have been on this list? Admittedly, I can't recall perfectly every one of these stories, but after rereading many of them for the purpose of making this video, these are the ones I enjoyed the most. Anyway, thanks for watching and stay Eldritch.